My name is Aaliyah. I am 32 years old and the designated black sheep of my family. At my parents' 30th anniversary gala, my mother stood in front of 200 elite guests and joked that my younger sister was secretly in love with my husband. The entire ballroom laughed while my sister smirked and batted her eyelashes. I was shaking with fury, ready to leave. Then my husband stood up, took the microphone and said one sentence that made my mother turn pale and my brother-in-law completely lose his mind. Before I reveal exactly how we dismantled their perfect image, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family. The clinking of a silver spoon against crystal echoed through the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta. 200 of Buckhead's finest residents fell into a respectful hush. Megachurch deacons, sorority chapter presidents, and city councilmen turned their attention to the center of the room. My mother Vivian stood radiant in a custom emerald green silk gown. She wrapped one arm around my father Roland, projecting the flawless image of a 30-year marriage built on faith, legacy, and generational wealth. 30 years, Vivian announced, her voice projected through the microphone, dripping with the practiced cadence of a woman who had spent decades curating her social status. They say the secret to a long marriage is compromise. But let us be honest, it is mostly about finding someone who looks good in family portraits. Polite, wealthy laughter rippled across the tables. I sat at table 4, not table 1, with the immediate family, but table 4, squeezed between my father's golf buddies and my younger sister's college friends. Beside me, my husband Malcolm gently rested his hand on my knee. His thumb traced a soothing circle over the silk of my dress. He already knew what was coming. We both did. Vivian scanned the room, her eyes locking onto our table with the precision of a sniper. Her smile sharpened into a blade. Speaking of looking good in portraits, she continued, gesturing loosely toward us. Look at Malcolm over there. Handsome, grounded, successful. Actually, I have a little family confession to make tonight. She paused dramatically. At table 1, my younger sister Brielle, the undisputed golden child of the family, leaned forward. Brielle sat next to her husband Spencer, a loud, flashy white finance executive my parents practically worshipped because he supposedly managed Wall Street hedge funds. Brielle has always said she had a massive crush on her brother-in-law. From day one, Vivian announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. She told me just last week that she wished she had met Malcolm before my dry, boring older sister got to him. I mean, can you blame her? Aaliyah has always been the serious one. Brielle is the passion. The ballroom erupted in raucous laughter. Several women chuckled, nodding in agreement. Brielle flipped her flawless hair over her shoulder, visibly preening, and deliberately raised her champagne glass toward Malcolm. She bit her bottom lip in a blatant display of disrespect. Spencer, sitting right next to her, merely chuckled, slapping his knee as if his wife lusting after another man was the punchline of the century. My vision blurred with a hot, blinding white fury. This was not a joke. It was a public execution. It was 32 years of being told my natural hair was too thick, my skin was too dark, and my ambitions in crisis public relations were too aggressive compared to Brielle pampered country club lifestyle. My chair scraped loudly against the marble floor as I pushed back to stand. I did not care about causing a scene. I was ready to tear the microphone from my mother's manicured hands. But Malcolm was faster. He did not look angry. He did not yell. Malcolm, a senior forensic financial investigator for a major accounting firm. A detail my parents conveniently ignored because they thought he was just a boring desk clerk, stood up with a lethal, terrifying calm. He smoothly intercepted a microphone from a passing audio technician near our table. You know, Vivian, you are absolutely right, Malcolm said, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the fading laughter. The room fell dead silent. Brielle is incredibly passionate, and she definitely has a huge crush on me. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. Vivian beamed, thinking Malcolm was playing along with her humiliating narrative. Passionate enough. Malcolm continued pulling his phone from his tuxedo pocket, that over the last 3 months she has sent me exactly 42 explicit photos from the master bathroom of that $5 million estate you all boast about. Passionate enough that she propositioned me in my own home while my wife was in the other room. The silence in the ballroom became an absolute vacuum. A waitress dropped a tray of appetizers. The crash sounded like an explosion. Vivian's emerald gown suddenly seemed to clash with the pale, sickly gray hue her face took on. Brielle's smug smile vanished, her jaw dropping open as she shrank back into her chair. Now Spencer Malcolm pivoted, his eyes locking onto the finance executive who was suddenly sitting rigidly upright. I know you are a busy man managing all that generational wealth for my father-in-law. But did you not find it strange that while your wife was texting me at 2 in the morning begging me to leave Aaliyah, your own platinum credit card was being swiped at the Four Seasons downtown for a suite booked under the name Amber, every Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon for the last year? Shut your mouth! Spencer jumped up. His face flushed a violent blotchy red. You are making this up! You are a nobody! Malcolm, enough. My father Roland finally broke out of his paralysis. He marched furiously from table 1, pointing a heavy finger at my husband. You come into my anniversary dinner and spew these disgusting lies. You are trying to destroy my family because you are jealous of Spencer's success. Aaliyah, control your husband right now, or I swear I will have the bank pull the commercial leases on every single property your boutique firm operates out of. I will ruin you by Monday morning. I stood up, stepping out from behind the table to stand shoulder to shoulder with Malcolm. My fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. You cannot pull my leases, Dad, I said, my voice echoing clearly without a microphone. Because I do not lease those properties anymore. I bought the buildings outright 6 months ago. Roland froze, his arms still suspended in the air. Malcolm smoothly handed the microphone to the nearest waiter, but before he let it go, he looked dead into Roland's eyes. And Roland, Malcolm said, his voice dropping an octave, meant only for our table and the immediate vicinity to hear. I would not worry about Aaliyah business on Monday morning. I would worry about the tax forms you and Spencer filed for the Church Charitable Foundation. Because when the federal auditors knock on your door tomorrow at 8 in the morning, they are not going to be looking for apologies. They are going to be looking for the missing $6 million. Malcolm took my hand. Come on, my love. The champagne here is cheap anyway. We turned our backs on the chaos, the gasps of the elite, my mother hyperventilating into a napkin, and Spencer frantically pulling out his phone, and walked out the grand double doors of the Ritz-Carlton. The night air was cool against my skin, but the war had just begun. We did not even make it to the valet stand before the cool night air could fully clear my lungs. The heavy brass doors of the Ritz-Carlton swung open behind us. My father's chief of staff, a towering man who handled the church's discreet security problems, stepped into our path. He politely but firmly informed us that Roland requested our immediate presence in the executive boardroom on the mezzanine level. I wanted to keep walking. I wanted to get into our car and leave that toxic circus behind forever. But Malcolm squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing my knuckles. We need to hear what they are going to say, he murmured. Let them dig the hole a little deeper. I nodded, letting the security detail escort us back inside. We avoided the main lobby where the guests were still whispering about my husband's microphone drop and slipped into the private elevator. The silence between floors was heavy, thick with the anticipation of the battle ahead. The boardroom smelled of expensive leather and desperate panic. Roland was pacing the length of the mahogany table, his custom bow tie discarded and his collar unbuttoned. Vivian sat frozen in a high-backed chair, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly her knuckles were white. Talia and Spencer stood in the far corner. Spencer was sweating profusely, running his hands through his slicked-back blonde hair, while Talia glared at me with a mixture of raw hatred and sheer terror. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us, the facade of the loving, benevolent pastor vanished. Roland slammed his hands onto the table, making the polished wood shudder. Do you have any idea what you have just done? He barked, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. You just invited the federal government into our lives, Aaliyah. You embarrassed this family in front of the mayor, the city council, and every major donor to our ministry. I stood my ground, refusing to let his booming voice shrink me back into the obedient, quiet daughter I used to be. I did not invite the federal government, I said calmly, keeping my posture straight. Spencer invited them when he decided to treat the church's foundation like his personal piggy bank. And you let him do it because you were too blinded by his supposed Wall Street pedigree to actually check his credentials. Vivian suddenly sprang to life, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. "We were trying to protect the community," she cried out, pointing a trembling finger at me. Spencer's investment firm was supposed to double the church's endowment. He hit a rough patch in the market. That is all it is, a temporary liquidity issue. We were handling it internally until your husband decided to play the hero and ruin our reputation. A rough patch, I repeated, staring at my mother in absolute disbelief. He spent church donations on luxury hotel suites for his mistress, and you are calling it a liquidity issue. Have you lost your mind entirely, or does your desperation to stay relevant in your elite sorority blind you to basic morality? Spencer stepped forward, his face still flushed but attempting to regain his arrogant finance bro posture. "You do not understand how high-level finance works, Aaliyah," he sneered. "The funds were leveraged. I just need capital to balance the margins before the quarter ends. It is standard practice in the industry." Roland reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the polished mahogany table toward me. He tapped the top page with his heavy gold pen. "This is a deed transfer." Roland said, his voice dropping into that smooth, manipulative tone he used during his Sunday sermons to extract tithes from his congregation. "You own those commercial buildings in Buckhead free and clear. They are valued at exactly $8 million. You are going to sign them over to Spencer's holding company tonight. We will use the equity to quietly replace the foundation funds before the audit on Monday. It is the only way to save the family name." I stared at the papers, feeling a sickening wave of familiar trauma wash over me. "You want me to give up the entire company I built from nothing to bail out the white man you chose over your own daughter?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "You did this exact same thing when I was 22. You forged my signature to take out a second loan on my first starter home just to pay for Talia's extravagant destination wedding in Italy. You ruined my credit for 7 years and told me it was my duty to support the family. And now you want the empire I bled to build just to save a thief." Vivian slammed her hand on the table, her eyes blazing with entitlement. "It is your duty. You are a Dubois. Spencer brings prestige and elite connections to this family that your little crisis management firm could never provide. If he goes down for fraud, the scandal will destroy the church. It will destroy our standing in Atlanta society. We will be laughingstocks. You will sign those papers, Aaliyah. You owe us for raising you. You owe your sister this much." I reached for the gold pen, my hand hovering over the signature line. A triumphant smirk began to form on Spencer's face, while my father let out a heavy sigh of relief. But before my fingers could graze the metal, Malcolm reached out and pulled the documents away. He did not even look at the contract. He just looked at Spencer with a chilling, knowing smile. "She is not signing anything," Malcolm said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Especially not to cover a $6 million hole. You see, Roland, you think Spencer lost that money in a bad hedge fund leverage. But when I ran the trace on the offshore accounts yesterday, I found something much more interesting. I found the discrepancy in Spencer's personal trust fund records." The smirk vanished from Spencer's face, instantly replaced by absolute stark terror. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost. "What discrepancy?" Roland demanded, looking between Malcolm and his son-in-law with sudden suspicion. Malcolm leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table. "Spencer does not have a trust fund, Roland. He never did. He is completely broke, and the $6 million did not go to his mistress. It went to a shell company in the Cayman Islands registered under a very familiar name. The name on that offshore account is yours, Roland." Malcolm let the words hang in the heavy air of the boardroom. My father collapsed back into his leather chair, all the bluster and righteous indignation draining from his face in an instant. Vivian covered her mouth with a trembling hand, looking frantically between her husband and her perfect son-in-law. Spencer tried to open his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I looked at the people who were supposed to protect me and realized they had been using the church funds to fund a fraudulent lifestyle while treating me like the family embarrassment. Malcolm took my arm and guided me toward the door, leaving them suffocating in their own lies. The morning sun felt heavy as I drove to my public relations firm in Buckhead. I needed the sanctuary of my office to process the massive betrayal of the previous night. The drive down Peachtree Street was usually my favorite part of the day, a reminder of the empire I had built from the ground up without a single cent of their dirty money. I pulled into my reserved parking spot and walked up to the glass entrance of my suite. My stomach dropped completely. A thick industrial steel chain was wrapped around the double doors, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. Taped directly to the glass was a neon orange legal notice of asset seizure. My keycard beeped red when I tapped it against the security scanner. I tried again, but the system locked me out. Before I could even reach into my bag for my phone, it began to ring. Spencer's name flashed on the screen. I answered the call, keeping my breathing slow and steady. "You really thought you and your little accountant husband could walk away after threatening me?" Spencer said, his voice oozing with unearned confidence and white privilege. "I am the managing director of the fund that holds the commercial lien on your business assets, Aaliyah. Your parents signed full power of attorney over to me last month. If Malcolm does not retract his statement and destroy whatever fake evidence he claims to have, your entire company goes up for public auction by Friday." I stared at the eviction notice, feeling a cold knot twist deep in my stomach. "You cannot seize assets you do not own, Spencer," I told him. "I bought this commercial space in cash 6 months ago." His laugh was a harsh, grating sound through the speaker. "You really should read the fine print on the church foundation loans your father took out 5 years ago. You are the primary guarantor, Aaliyah. When the foundation defaulted on its obligations last quarter, your business assets became collateral." I ended the call and leaned against the cold glass door. My mind raced back to my senior year of college. My mother had brought a thick stack of legal documents to my dormitory, telling me they were standard forms for a family trust fund meant to secure my future. She had rushed me to sign them, complaining that she had a hair appointment at the country club and could not wait for me to read every single page. I had trusted my mother completely back then. Instead, she had used my social security number to co-sign a massive commercial loan to fund Spencer failing ventures. I drove back to my house in a state of pure, silent focus. I did not shed a single tear. Tears were a luxury I could not afford right now. Malcolm was sitting at our kitchen island with his laptop open and multiple financial spreadsheets spread across the granite counter. I dropped my purse on the sofa and told him exactly what Spencer had done. Malcolm did not look surprised at all. He simply pulled another chair out for me and turned his glowing screen toward my direction. "I was already tracking the guarantor signatures," he said quietly, resting his hand over mine. "Your parents pledged your future earnings and your business assets to secure a $3 million line of credit for Spencer. They did this while telling the entire Atlanta elite social scene that you were a financial failure who needed their pity and prayers." I looked at the digital copies of the loan documents displaying on the screen. There was my signature forged on several pages alongside the few pages I had actually signed years ago in my dorm room. They had sacrificed my financial security to buy Spencer a seat at the prestigious golf club and to buy Brielle a life of luxury she never had to work for. My own mother had literally stolen my identity to fund the golden child's lavish lifestyle. I asked Malcolm how we could untangle my business from their fraudulent loans before Friday. He began pulling up the routing numbers associated with the church foundation disbursements. The money Spencer claimed he lost in the stock market was actually funneled through a complex web of shell companies. We spent the next 4 hours following the digital breadcrumbs across multiple international borders. Malcolm's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the basic security protocols Spencer had poorly set up to hide his tracks. Every time Spencer told my parents he was securing high-yield returns on Wall Street, he was actually taking their money and the church donations to pay off his own massive personal debts. He was running a classic Ponzi scheme using the church reputation to lure in wealthy black investors. But the numbers still did not completely add up. There was a missing piece to the puzzle. Spencer was siphoning money, but Roland had to be aware of the missing capital. My father was too obsessed with wealth to let millions slip away unnoticed unless he was getting a cut of the profits. Malcolm paused his typing and leaned closer to the screen. His brow furrowed as he highlighted a recurring wire transfer that had been buried deep in the church foundation operational expenses. Every single month for the past 3 years, exactly $50,000 had been routed under the guise of an international ministry outreach program. Malcolm ran the routing number through a secure federal database he had access to. "Aaliyah, look at this," he said, his voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. I stared at the screen, reading the details of the offshore account located in the Bahamas. It was not registered to Spencer, and it was not registered to Roland. The primary account holder was someone who claimed she barely knew how to use a credit card. It was my mother, Vivian. I stared at the name on the screen, feeling the last remaining threads of my childhood illusions snap and disintegrate. Vivian, my elegant, proper mother, who always claimed she could barely balance a checkbook and relied entirely on my father for financial literacy, was the primary account holder of a hidden offshore trust. She was not just blindly defending Spencer to save the family image. She was actively protecting her own stolen wealth. Malcolm did not say a word. He just highlighted the transactions and began downloading every single ledger into an encrypted hard drive. We had the proof. Spencer was the loud, arrogant smokescreen, while my mother was the quiet, meticulous thief, draining the church foundation $50,000 at a time. Before I could even wrap my mind around the sheer magnitude of her hypocrisy, my phone buzzed on the granite counter. Then it buzzed again. And again. It was not Spencer this time. The notifications were pouring in from my private sorority alumni group chat and the Buckhead Country Club Women's Committee. I picked up the phone and opened the first message from a woman named Patricia, who had been my mother's tennis partner for a decade. "Aaliyah, we are all praying for your mental healing," Patricia wrote. "Please know that there is no shame in seeking psychiatric help. We are here for your mother during this dark season." I frowned, swiping to the next message. This one was from my former college roommate Chloe, who was currently serving on the country club board. "Aaliyah, call me immediately," Chloe texted. "Your mother just hosted an emergency prayer brunch at the club. She told everyone you are having a severe psychotic break." I called Chloe immediately. She picked up on the first ring, her voice hushed, as if she was hiding in a bathroom stall. "Aaliyah, what is going on?" Chloe whispered frantically. Vivian was sobbing over mimosas. "She told 50 of the most influential women in Atlanta that you have completely lost your mind. She claimed you are hallucinating financial crimes and attacking the family because you are deeply jealous of Brielle. She even said Malcolm is a controlling manipulator who is feeding your delusions to isolate you from your loved ones." A cold, calculating anger settled over me, replacing the shock. This was not just typical socialite gossip. This was a tactical strike. Vivian knew we had the financial records. She knew we were going to expose the missing $6 million. By painting me as a mentally unstable, jealous sister experiencing a psychotic break, she was discrediting her primary witness before I could even take the evidence to the authorities or the church board. If I went public with the offshore accounts now, the entire elite circle would just shake their heads and whisper about the poor crazy daughter making up wild conspiracies. "She also told everyone your business is failing." Chloe continued, her voice filled with concern. "She said the stress of impending bankruptcy is what triggered your breakdown. She claimed your parents had to step in and take over your commercial leases just to save you from absolute ruin." I thanked Chloe for warning me and ended the call. I looked at Malcolm, who had been listening to the conversation through the speakerphone. He was already pulling up the contact information for our corporate attorney. "They locked down my office to make the bankruptcy lie look real," I said, connecting the dots. Spencer used the forged power of attorney to slap a fake lien on my doors so anyone walking by would think my firm was seized. Then Vivian spins the narrative at the country club that I am having a mental breakdown over my failing business. It is a perfectly orchestrated smear campaign. Malcolm dialed the attorney and put him on speaker. We spent the next hour dismantling their legal trap. Because I had purchased the buildings in cash through an independent holding company, the power of attorney my parents forged years ago was completely invalid for those specific assets. Our lawyer assured us he could have a judge issue an emergency injunction to remove Spencer's fraudulent padlock by the end of the day. He also advised us to file identity theft charges regarding the original commercial loan. But clearing the legal hurdle was only half the battle. The social damage was already spreading like wildfire. In Atlanta, society perception was reality. If the narrative that I was clinically insane took root, it would destroy my public relations firm and protect my parents' golden reputation. I could not fight this from my kitchen. I had to face the very women my mother was currently manipulating. I walked upstairs to my closet and pulled out a tailored white designer suit. I brushed my hair back into a sleek, flawless bun and applied my makeup with military precision. I was not going to look like a woman having a breakdown. I was going to look like a woman who owned the room. Malcolm watched me from the doorway, leaning against the frame with a quiet pride in his eyes. "Are we going to the country club?" he asked, smoothly tossing his car keys in his hand. "No," I said, slipping on my heels. "I am going to the country club. You are going to take that encrypted hard drive directly to the federal field office. Let Vivian play her little games with the sorority sisters. We are going to let the authorities handle the actual crimes." I drove my luxury SUV through the wrought iron gates of the Buckhead Country Club, flashing a bright, composed smile to the security guard who waved me through. The afternoon sun beat down on the perfectly manicured golf greens, but my focus was entirely on the grand clubhouse dining room. My mother was supposedly holding her afternoon prayer circle surrounded by the wealthiest, most well-connected women in the city. They were probably still dabbing their eyes and whispering about my tragic mental collapse. I walked through the heavy glass doors, the click of my heels echoing sharply against the marble lobby floor. I bypassed the hostess stand and headed straight for the private dining atrium. Through the French doors, I could see Vivian sitting at the head of a long table, holding a lace handkerchief to her nose. Patricia and several other prominent women were leaning in, holding her hands and offering words of comfort. I pushed the French doors open. The heavy wood swung wide with a loud thud that instantly silenced the entire room. 50 women turned their heads simultaneously, their eyes widening in collective shock. I stood in the doorway, perfectly composed, radiant in my white suit, holding my designer handbag with a relaxed, elegant grip. "Hello, ladies," I said, my voice clear, steady, and projecting perfectly across the silent room. I heard there was an emergency prayer circle dedicated to my well-being. I figured it was only polite for the guest of honor to attend. Vivian dropped her handkerchief. Her perfectly made-up face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray, as she stared at the daughter she had just spent 3 hours convincing everyone was locked away in a psychotic delusion. I slowly walked into the room, letting the silence stretch until the tension was thick enough to choke on. Patricia stood up nervously, taking a step back from my mother. "Aaliyah, sweetheart," Patricia stammered, looking me up and down, searching for any sign of the mania Vivian had described. "We were just so worried about you. Your mother said you were not well." "I am perfectly well, Patricia," I replied, offering her a warm, professional smile before turning my gaze directly onto Vivian. "But I can understand why my mother would desperately want you all to believe otherwise. You see, when someone gets caught siphoning $50,000 a month from a church charitable foundation into a private offshore account in the Bahamas, their first instinct is usually to silence the person who found the receipts." Gasps echoed around the table. Someone dropped a crystal champagne flute and it shattered against the marble floor. Vivian tried to stand up, but her knees gave out and she fell hard back into her chair. Vivian slumped in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as the silence in the private dining atrium grew deafening. Patricia and the other elite women exchanged horrified glances, looking from my pale mother to me, standing tall in my white designer suit. I did not raise my voice or break my professional smile. I simply told the room that mental health is indeed a serious matter, but federal financial fraud carries a mandatory minimum sentence. I advised them to check their own investment portfolios if they had trusted Spencer with their money. Then I turned on my heel and walked out of the Buckhead Country Club, leaving Vivian to explain the unexplainable to the very women she had tried to weaponize against me. The next morning, my phone screen lit up with an invitation forwarded by Chloe. Brielle was hosting the annual Children's Hospital Charity Brunch at the Four Seasons downtown. It was the most exclusive philanthropic event of the season, a gathering where Atlanta's wealthiest families pledged hundreds of thousands of dollars over bottomless mimosas and imported caviar. Brielle was the newly appointed chairwoman of the committee, a position my mother had heavily lobbied and paid for to secure my sister's status. This brunch was supposed to be Brielle's crowning social achievement. More importantly, it was her ultimate opportunity to flaunt the lavish lifestyle funded entirely by the money Spencer had stolen from my business and the church foundation. I wore a sleek charcoal gray dress that screamed quiet authority and arrived 30 minutes after the brunch began. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons was transformed into a springtime wonderland with massive floral centerpieces cascading down every table and crystal chandeliers sparkling overhead. I slipped past the registration desk, flashing a confident smile to the event coordinators, who recognized me as Roland and Vivian daughter. They had no idea I was the family outcast who was currently dismantling their entire empire. I stood near the back of the room observing my sister. Brielle was holding court near the main stage wearing a custom pink silk gown and dripping in diamonds that probably cost more than a starter home. She was laughing loudly, tossing her flawless hair and waving her champagne glass as she spoke to a group of major real estate developers and hedge fund managers. Spencer stood right beside her wearing a bespoke Italian suit, looking every bit the successful financial genius he pretended to be. They looked invincible. They looked like royalty. They looked completely unaware that the federal government was already reviewing the encrypted hard drive Malcolm had delivered the previous afternoon. I walked slowly toward the center of the ballroom, grabbing a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. I needed to act quickly before Vivian or Roland arrived to run interference. My mother was likely still doing frantic damage control from the country club disaster, but Spencer primary investors were all gathered right here in this room. These were the people who blindly trusted the pastoral family reputation. These were the people keeping Spencer's massive Ponzi scheme afloat with their heavy cash infusions. I approached a high-top table where Marcus Vance, a prominent commercial real estate developer, was standing with two other wealthy investors. Marcus had known my father for decades and had recently transferred a large portion of his liquid assets into Spencer's supposedly exclusive high-yield management fund. I greeted him warmly, extending my hand. He looked surprised to see me, but returned the greeting with a polite smile. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice booming over the background music. "We did not expect to see you here today. Your mother mentioned you were taking some time off to deal with some severe personal stress." I smiled, letting out a soft, practiced laugh. "You know how Vivian loves to exaggerate," I said smoothly. "I am actually here doing some preliminary crisis management research. My firm has been incredibly busy lately, tracking down displaced assets for clients who trusted the wrong financial advisors." Marcus frowned slightly, taking a sip of his drink. "Displaced assets," he repeated, his tone shifting from casual to curious. "Yes, it is quite a growing problem in Buckhead right now." I continued, keeping my voice low and confiding. "We are seeing a terrifying trend of portfolio managers using shell companies in the Cayman Islands to hide massive margin calls. They leverage their clients' money to fund their own luxury lifestyles and cover their tracks with falsified quarterly reports. It is a classic Ponzi structure, but they dress it up in Wall Street terminology so the investors never see it coming until the federal auditors freeze the accounts." The two other investors at the table exchanged sharp, nervous glances. Marcus lowered his glass, his eyes narrowing as he looked over at Spencer, who was currently laughing loudly across the room. "That sounds very specific, Aaliyah," Marcus said. his voice dropping to a serious whisper. Are you suggesting there is a local firm under investigation? I would never name names before the federal indictments are unsealed, Marcus, I said, offering an empathetic look. But I will say that if I had my money tied up with a flashy fund manager who recently bought his wife a brand new estate and a matching diamond necklace, while his portfolio returns remain mysteriously stagnant, I would request an immediate independent audit of my accounts by Monday morning. I would specifically ask to see the raw transaction logs, not just the curated summary statements. And I would pull my capital out before the asset forfeiture unit locks the doors. The color drained from Marcus' face. He was a smart man. He did not need me to draw him a map to realize I was talking about Spencer. He immediately pulled out his phone, his fingers typing rapidly to contact his personal accountant. The two other men at the table quickly excused themselves, pulling their own devices out as they hurried toward the lobby. I did not stop there. I moved gracefully through the ballroom, stopping at 4 more tables targeting the most influential donors and investors who had close financial ties to Spencer. I did not make wild accusations or yell. I simply dropped targeted financial terminology and referenced offshore accounts disappearing margins and impending federal asset freezes. I asked innocent questions about whether their recent dividend checks had cleared on time. I sympathized with the current market volatility, while hinting that some local brokers were hiding massive personal debts behind church charitable foundations and forged commercial leases. It only took 20 minutes for the panic to spread. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were terrified of losing their money, and elite gossip was their primary currency. The whispers rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave. I watched from the corner as smiles vanished and tense, hushed conversations broke out across the floral centerpieces. Several major donors abruptly put down their drinks and marched toward the exit, their phones pressed tightly to their ears. The carefully curated atmosphere of philanthropy dissolved into a frantic scramble for financial preservation. Brielle finally noticed the shifting atmosphere. Her bright, oblivious smile faltered as she watched half of her VIP guest list suddenly rushing out the doors before the charity auction had even begun. She looked around frantically, trying to understand why her perfect event was falling apart. Then her eyes locked onto me, standing calmly near the ice sculpture. Her pink silk gown rustled loudly as she stomped across the ballroom floor, her face flushed with absolute fury. Spencer was close behind her, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by a frantic, sweaty panic as he watched his biggest investors literally running away from him. "What are you doing here?" Brielle hissed, stopping inches from my face. "You are not invited, Aaliyah. Mom told everyone you are sick and having a breakdown. You are ruining my brunch." I looked at the massive diamonds dripping from her neck. The same diamonds paid for by the commercial leases she and my parents had stolen from me. "I am not ruining anything, Brielle," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I am just reminding your guests to check their bank accounts. It seems Spencer forgot to tell them that his entire financial empire is built on stolen church donations and my forged signature." Spencer lunged forward, his face contorted in a desperate rage. "Shut your mouth!" he demanded, his voice cracking. "You are lying. You are crazy, just like Vivian said. I am calling security to have you dragged out of here right now." "Call them, Spencer," I challenged, taking a step toward him. "Call the police while you are at it. I am sure the federal agents sitting in the lobby right now would love to have a word with you about the Cayman Island wire transfers." Spencer's eyes went wide with pure, undisguised terror. He looked past me toward the grand ballroom entrance where 2 men in dark suits had just walked through the double doors, flashing gold badges to the event staff. The 2 federal agents bypassed the ice sculpture and walked directly toward our table. Spencer did not wait to hear what they had to say. He turned on his heel and shoved his way through the remaining crowd, leaving Brielle standing alone in her pink silk gown. She screamed his name, but he was already sprinting toward the valet stand. I watched him run, knowing exactly where his fragile male ego would take him next. He was not going to his lawyer. He was going to find the man he blamed for his crumbling empire. He was going to find my husband. Malcolm worked on the 30th floor of a sleek glass building in Midtown. To my parents and Spencer, he was just a boring number cruncher trapped in a cubicle. They had never bothered to ask what his actual title was. If they had asked, they would have known that Malcolm was a senior forensic auditor who held a top-tier security clearance and contracted directly with the federal government. He specialized in dismantling complex financial crimes for the authorities. Spencer burst through the glass doors of Malcolm's firm, his expensive Italian suit dark with sweat. He ignored the shocked receptionist and marched straight down the corridor, checking nameplates until he found Malcolm's office. He shoved the heavy mahogany door open without knocking, making it crash loudly against the wall. Malcolm was sitting behind his pristine desk, reviewing a thick stack of printed ledgers. He did not look surprised to see my brother-in-law panting and red-faced in his doorway. Malcolm calmly placed his pen down and looked up, waiting for the tantrum to begin. "You think you are so smart," Spencer spat, his voice shaking with a desperate rage as he stormed into the room. He slammed both of his hands down on Malcolm's desk, knocking over a cup of silver pens. "You think you can send the feds to my charity brunch and just walk away? I will ruin you. I will have your managing partner fire you by the end of the day. I play golf with the men who own this entire building. You are a nobody." Malcolm folded his hands together and leaned back in his leather chair. He looked at Spencer the way a scientist observes a rat trapped in a maze. "You cannot have me fired." "Spencer." Malcolm set his voice low and smooth. "My managing partner does not handle my contracts. The Department of Justice handles my contracts." Spencer blinked, his arrogant sneer faltering for a fraction of a second before he doubled down on his aggressive threats. "You are a glorified desk clerk," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Malcolm's chest. "You manipulate spreadsheets for mid-level managers. Do not try to bluff me. You hacked into my private servers and stole confidential financial data. That is a massive federal crime. I am going to have you arrested for cyber espionage, and then I am going to take everything you and Aaliyah own." Spencer leaned closer, his breath smelling of stale champagne and panic. "You are going to sign a formal retraction," he demanded. "You are going to tell the feds that Aaliyah made the whole thing up because she is mentally unstable and deeply jealous of Brielle. If you do exactly what I say and fix this mess, I might let you keep your miserable little pension." Malcolm stood up slowly. He was taller than Spencer and carried a quiet, lethal authority that instantly shifted the power dynamic in the room. He picked up a thick gray folder from the corner of his desk and tossed it casually in front of Spencer. It landed with a heavy thud. "I did not hack your servers," Malcolm said, his tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. "I walked through the front door of your digital security because you used a basic commercial encryption that a teenager could bypass. But more importantly, I did not need to hack anything. The Securities and Exchange Commission granted me full subpoena power over your accounts 3 days ago." Spencer stared down at the gray folder. His hands shook violently as he reached out and opened the cover. Inside the folder were high-resolution satellite photographs of the Cayman Island bank branches, copies of his offshore wire transfers, and a direct mandate from the Federal Bureau of Investigation bearing Malcolm's signature as the lead forensic investigator. "You see," Spencer Malcolm continued walking slowly around the desk until he was standing inches away from my brother-in-law. "My parents-in-law thought I was a nobody because I do not boast about my salary at country club dinners. But my actual job is hunting down arrogant, careless thieves just like you. I track dirty money for the federal government, and your money is the dirtiest I have seen in a long time." Spencer tried to swallow, but his throat was completely dry. He looked back down at the documents, his eyes wide with pure, undisguised terror. "You did not just steal from a church charitable foundation," Malcolm said, his voice dropping to a cold, deadly whisper. "You wired stolen assets across international borders while claiming religious tax exemptions. That is wire fraud, money laundering, and federal tax evasion. You are looking at a mandatory minimum sentence that will keep you in a federal penitentiary until your hair turns gray." The red flush completely drained from Spencer's face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out as he hit the edge of the leather guest chair. "You cannot do this," he gasped, his voice suddenly sounding small and hollow. "My father-in-law will cover the shortage. Roland has the funds in his private accounts. We can replace the missing money by Friday. We can make a deal. I can give you whatever you want. There is no deal, Malcolm said, his eyes unyielding. The federal agents at the hotel today were not there to ask you polite questions. They were there to serve the emergency asset freeze on your holding companies. Every bank account you own is currently locked down tight. Your platinum credit cards are dead. Your passport has been officially flagged by Homeland Security. You have exactly $0 and zero leverage left. Spencer collapsed into the chair, covering his face with his trembling hands. A loud, pathetic sob ripped from his chest. The arrogant Wall Street prodigy was entirely gone, replaced by a broken, terrified criminal who finally realized he had picked a fight with the absolute wrong man. "You came into my office threatening to take my job and ruin my wife," Malcolm said, looking down at the crying man with utter disgust. "Now I am going to watch the federal marshals take your freedom. You have about 20 minutes before they arrive here to escort you to a holding cell. I suggest you use that time to call a very good defense attorney." Malcolm turned his back on Spencer and walked back to his desk. He picked up his phone and dialed my number, leaving Spencer to suffocate in the terrifying reality of his own destruction. Malcolm called me exactly 20 minutes later. His voice was calm and steady as he told me Spencer was currently being escorted out of the glass building in handcuffs by federal marshals. I sat in my car in the Four Seasons parking garage, gripping the steering wheel as a profound sense of relief washed over me. The golden child's husband was finally facing the consequences of his actions, but I knew my parents would not accept this defeat gracefully. Vivian and Roland had spent their entire lives protecting their pristine image, and they would burn the world down before letting Spencer's scandal stain their reputation. The retaliation happened faster than I anticipated. The next morning, I stopped at a local cafe in Buckhead to grab a coffee before heading to my office. When I swiped my corporate card, the terminal beeped a harsh red declined message. I frowned and handed the barista my personal debit card. Declined again. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I stepped out of the line and opened my banking app on my phone. Every single account tied to my name, including the childhood trust fund and the legacy savings accounts my grandfather had established, had been completely frozen. A large red banner across the screen indicated a temporary administrative hold authorized by the primary trustee. Roland had pulled the plug on my finances. Before I could even call my bank, a voicemail notification popped up on my screen. It was my father. I pressed play and held the phone to my ear, listening to his cold, calculating voice. "Aaliyah, your mother and I are deeply disappointed in your vindictive behavior," Roland said, his tone dripping with righteous authority. "You have allowed your jealousy to tear this family apart, and we will not fund your destructive tantrums. We have frozen all of your accounts and suspended your trust. When you are ready to drop these ridiculous federal charges against Spencer and issue a public apology to your sister, we can discuss reinstating your allowance. Until then, you are completely cut off, and Vivian expects you to publicly retract your statements by tonight." I stood on the sidewalk listening to the message again. My parents actually believed they were starving me out. They thought the money in those childhood accounts was my only lifeline. They honestly believed that without their financial backing, my public relations firm would collapse, and I would come crawling back to them begging for forgiveness. They had spent my entire life underestimating my intelligence and treating me like the family failure. Vivian had always sneered at my little business ventures, telling her friends that I was just playing at being a professional while Brielle was building a real legacy. What Roland and Vivian did not know was that the public relations firm was just my passion project. It was the respectable, quiet business I ran to keep them from asking too many questions about how I funded my life. My real wealth was hidden safely behind a complex web of corporate holding companies. 7 years ago, I had taken the modest profits from my first few PR contracts and quietly invested in a series of highly successful tech startups. Those early investments had grown exponentially, allowing me to establish my own private venture capital firm. My firm currently managed over $60 million in assets. I did not need their allowance. I had more liquid capital than Roland and Vivian had ever seen in their entire lives. I drove straight to my private wealth manager's office in Midtown. Malcolm met me there, his laptop already open on the mahogany conference table. We sat down with my portfolio manager, and I played the voicemail from my father. "They want to play financial war games," I said, my voice completely steady. "Let us see how much leverage Roland actually has." Malcolm began pulling up the public financial records associated with my parents' sprawling Buckhead estate. It did not take long to find the massive cracks in their perfect facade. To maintain their lavish country club lifestyle and to continually bail Spencer out of his early investment failures, Roland and Vivian had taken out 3 massive secondary mortgages on their primary residence. They were living entirely on borrowed credit. Their debt was heavily leveraged through a boutique private lending group that catered to high-net-worth clients who needed fast cash without traditional banking oversight. My portfolio manager reviewed the lending group's corporate structure. He noted that the private lender had recently been seeking liquidity and was quietly trying to offload several of their high-risk debt portfolios. My parents' mortgages were bundled right at the top of that high-risk list. Roland had missed 2 payments last quarter because he had funneled the cash to Brielle to buy her a new luxury SUV and fund her lavish charity brunches. They were drowning in debt and using the church foundation to keep their heads above water. Buy the debt. I instructed my manager, leaning back in my chair. Buy the entire portfolio today. Use the corporate shell company so my name does not appear on the initial transfer documents. I want full ownership of their mortgages before the banks close this afternoon. Do whatever it takes and offer a premium if they try to stall. The manager nodded, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he initiated the massive capital transfer. Malcolm watched the screens tracking the digital movement of funds as my venture capital firm systematically purchased the paper that held my parents' entire life together. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation as the digital signatures were routed through our corporate attorneys. It took 4 hours of intense legal maneuvering and offshore wire transfers to clear the bureaucratic hurdles. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the transaction was officially complete and verified. The boutique lender had gladly sold off the risky debt for a clean cash buyout. I sat in the quiet conference room, looking at the digital confirmation on the screen. My parents had tried to leave me penniless by freezing my childhood savings. They had arrogantly assumed I was a helpless little girl who needed their money to survive. Instead, they had just forced my hand and handed me the keys to their destruction. I pulled up the legal deed to their massive suburban mansion. The title transfer was currently processing, but the financial rights now belonged entirely to my holding company. I smiled, feeling a deep, profound sense of justice settling over me. Roland and Vivian thought they could evict me from the family, but they did not realize I was officially their landlord. The very next morning, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Roland. He did not sound angry anymore. He sounded arrogant and victorious. He told me that since Malcolm and I had finally seen reason and fixed Spencer's books, it was time to make it official. The federal agents had temporarily backed off, which Roland mistakenly believed was because of the clean audit we provided. He demanded that Malcolm and I attend an emergency meeting with the Charity Foundation Board that afternoon. We were going to sit there and testify that Spencer's financial discrepancies were nothing more than a clerical error. Roland said he would unfreeze my accounts the moment Malcolm signed the official audit release in front of the board. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully blackmailed us into submission. I looked across the kitchen island at Malcolm, who was sipping his black coffee and reading the morning financial news. I put the phone on speaker so he could hear my father's smug demands. I told my father we would be there. I kept my voice meek and compliant, playing the role of the defeated daughter who just wanted her trust fund back. Roland chuckled a dry, condescending sound and told me not to be late. He reminded me that family loyalty was the only thing that mattered, and that he was glad I had finally learned my place. When the call ended, Malcolm smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. "They really have no idea," he said, setting his mug down. The federal agents backing off was not a retreat. It was the quiet before the storm. The DOJ had spent the night reviewing the mirror drive we handed over, and they were preparing a synchronized strike. We arrived at the country club banquet room where the emergency board meeting was taking place. The room was filled with the wealthiest and most influential members of our community. These were the people who had trusted Spencer and my parents with their money. Roland and Vivian were standing at the front of the room looking like royalty holding court. Spencer was there too, looking pale but attempting to project his usual arrogant swagger. Brielle clung to his arm, wearing a designer dress that was undoubtedly paid for with stolen funds. When we walked in, the room grew quiet. Vivian gave me a tight, approving nod as if I were a disobedient child who had finally been housebroken. Roland took the podium and tapped the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming and announced that the recent rumors regarding Spencer's management of the foundation were completely unfounded. He stated that an independent forensic audit conducted by my husband had proven that the missing funds were simply a temporary accounting glitch. My father then called Malcolm to the front of the room to present the findings and sign the official document clearing Spencer's name. My mother looked at me and mouthed the words "thank you" with a sickeningly sweet smile. I smiled back, knowing it would be the last time she ever looked at me with anything other than pure hatred. Malcolm walked up to the podium carrying his leather briefcase. He did not look nervous. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He pulled out a thick stack of papers and set them on the podium. The room was completely silent, waiting for him to validate the lies my family had spun. I did conduct an audit of Spencer's accounts. Malcolm began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the large room. Roland beamed, and Spencer let out a visible breath of relief. However, Malcolm continued, "The documents I hold here are not the ones Roland and Spencer asked me to present today. Those documents were a fabrication designed to hide the truth." The smile instantly vanished from my father's face. Vivian stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Malcolm, what are you doing?" she hissed, her voice trembling with sudden panic. "I am doing my job," Vivian Malcolm said, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "I am a senior forensic investigator for the federal government. And the real audit I conducted yesterday confirmed that Spencer has embezzled over $6 million from this foundation to fund his private lifestyle and offshore accounts." The room erupted into chaos. Board members gasped and started shouting out in shock. Spencer lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from the podium, but Malcolm stepped back, effortlessly avoiding him. "You cannot do this!" Spencer screamed, his face turning purple with rage. "We had a deal. You promised you would fix it." "I never promised to fix anything," Malcolm replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I simply agreed to look at the books. What I found was a decade of systemic fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has already reviewed these real ledgers." Roland marched toward me, his face contorted with fury. "You did this!" he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at my face. "You set us up, you vindictive little brat. I will ruin you. I will make sure you never see a dime of your inheritance." I stood my ground, not backing away an inch. I looked at my father, feeling absolutely nothing but pity for the small, arrogant man he truly was. "You cannot ruin me, Roland," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the panicked room. "And I do not need your money. I have never needed it." Vivian rushed over, grabbing my arm. "How could you do this to your own family?" she cried. "We are going to lose everything because of your jealousy." I pulled my arm away from her grasp. "You lost everything the moment you decided that appearances were more important than integrity," I told her. "And speaking of losing everything, you should probably check your email, Vivian." She stared at me in confusion. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I pulled out my phone and opened the digital deed to their estate. I held the screen up so both of my parents could see it clearly. "You froze my accounts thinking it would starve me into submission," I explained. "But you did not know that I own a private venture capital firm, the same firm that just bought out all 3 of the secondary mortgages you defaulted on." Roland and Vivian stared at the screen, their eyes wide with absolute horror as the realization washed over them. The color completely drained from my father's face. "I own your house, Roland," I said, letting the words sink in. "I am your landlord. And as of this morning, I have officially initiated foreclosure proceedings. You have exactly 7 days to vacate my property." Before my parents could even process the magnitude of their destruction, the heavy oak doors at the back of the banquet room swung open. A team of federal agents walked in, their badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. The lead agent stepped forward and read Spencer his rights before placing him in handcuffs right in front of the entire board of directors. Brielle began screaming hysterically as they led her husband away. My parents stood frozen, paralyzed by the public humiliation they had spent their entire lives trying to avoid. The perfect facade was entirely shattered. The legacy they had worshipped was gone. And as Malcolm walked back to my side, taking my hand in his, I knew the war was finally over. The morning after Spencer's arrest, the reality of our victory settled over me. But the federal investigation was far from complete. Malcolm and I returned to Spencer's office complex just after dawn. The federal agents had secured the perimeter, but Malcolm needed to access the offline servers hidden in the basement vault to download the final decrypted versions of the real ledgers. These were the master files that contained the exact routing numbers for Spencer's offshore accounts. I walked beside my husband, feeling a deep sense of peace as we navigated the empty hallways of the company that had once been the crown jewel of my parents' pride. Malcolm unlocked the heavy door to the server room and connected his federal-issued laptop to the main terminal. The room hummed with the loud sound of cooling fans as he began the massive data extraction. I told him I was going to step into the main lobby to answer a call from my property manager regarding the eviction notices for my parents' estate. I left the door slightly ajar so Malcolm would not be completely isolated in the windowless room. I had only been in the lobby for 10 minutes when the front glass doors slid open. Brielle walked in looking nothing like the polished golden child who had sneered at me her entire life. Her designer dress was wrinkled and stained, and her eyes were bloodshot from crying. She had clearly not slept since the federal marshals took her husband away from the country club. She did not even notice me standing in the shadowed alcove near the reception desk. Her eyes were fixed on the hallway leading to the server room. I stayed perfectly still, watching my sister as she marched toward the room where my husband was working. I followed quietly, my footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. When I reached the hallway, I could hear Brielle's voice echoing from the server room. She was not yelling or crying anymore. Her tone had shifted into a sickeningly soft purr that made my stomach turn. She had cornered Malcolm while he was waiting for the final ledgers to download. "Malcolm," she said, her voice dripping with calculated vulnerability. "You have to help me. Spencer is ruined. They froze everything, and the lawyers are demanding retainers I cannot pay. He is broke, Malcolm. My husband is a total fraud, and he left me with absolutely nothing." I stood just outside the door listening to my sister throw the man she had flaunted for years completely under the bus. Malcolm did not step away from his laptop. His eyes remained fixed on the downloading progress bar. "That sounds like a personal problem," Malcolm replied, his voice deliberately flat and professional. "You should probably leave because this is an active federal crime scene." Brielle ignored his warning and stepped closer, bridging the physical distance between them. I peeked around the doorframe and saw her place a manicured hand squarely on my husband's chest. She looked up at him through her eyelashes, using the exact same manipulative charm that had worked on our parents since we were children. "I always knew Spencer was weak," she whispered, stepping even closer until she was invading his personal space. "He was just a little boy playing with numbers he did not understand. But you, Malcolm, you are a real man. You have real power. You hold all the cards now. You could accidentally delete those files. You could make this all go away for me." I felt a surge of pure disgust. My sister, the woman who had mocked my marriage and called my husband a boring desk clerk, was now throwing herself at him because he was the only man left with any actual power. She was begging him to commit a federal crime to save her lavish lifestyle. "I do not need Spencer," Brielle continued, her fingers tracing the lapel of Malcolm's jacket. "I need someone who can take care of me. Someone strong." I always wondered what it would be like to be with a man who actually knew how to control a room. "We could make a deal, Malcolm. Just you and me. Aaliyah does not have to know. She was always so blind anyway. She is too basic for a man like you. You deserve a woman who understands how to navigate high society." Malcolm looked down at her hand on his chest, as if she were a piece of rotting garbage that had blown in from the street. He did not move away. Instead, he calmly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his federal identification badge. Attached to the lanyard was a small, blinking black device. Brielle's hand dropped from his chest as she stared at the flashing red light. As a senior forensic auditor operating under a federal mandate, Malcolm said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "I am required to wear a continuous audio and video recording device while inside a secured crime scene. Everything you just said has been transmitted directly to the Department of Justice servers in real time." All the color drained from Brielle's face. She stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. "You just admitted on a federal recording that you are fully aware your husband is broke, and that his funds are fraudulent," Malcolm continued, his eyes locking onto her terrified gaze. "You also just attempted to bribe and seduce a federal contractor to destroy government evidence. That is a felony, Brielle. Tampering with an ongoing investigation carries a mandatory sentence." Brielle let out a strangled gasp. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking violently. "No, Malcolm, please, I was just joking. I was just upset. You cannot send that to the feds. My parents will disown me. I will go to jail." "You should have thought about that before you tried to proposition my husband," I said, stepping out of the shadows and walking into the server room. Brielle spun around, letting out a sharp scream when she saw me standing there. She looked completely broken, stripped of every ounce of arrogance she had ever possessed. The golden child was finally facing a situation that tears and manipulation could not fix. "You are pathetic, Brielle," I told her, looking her up and down with utter contempt. "You spent your entire life tearing me down to make yourself feel superior. You married a criminal just to show off your wealth, and the second he gets caught, you try to sleep with my husband to save your own skin. There is no rock bottom for you, is there?" She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "Aaliyah, please," she begged, crawling toward me. "Please do not let him ruin me. I have nothing left. Spencer took everything. I am your sister." The computer chimed, signaling that the download of the real ledgers was 100% complete. Malcolm closed the laptop and placed it in his briefcase, locking it with a sharp, definitive click. "You stopped being my sister a long time ago," I said, looking down at the crying woman on the floor. "You made your choices, Brielle. Now you get to live with them." Malcolm walked over to me and placed his hand gently on the small of my back, guiding me toward the door. We stepped over my weeping sister and walked out of the server room, leaving her alone with the consequences of her own desperation. The federal agents were waiting in the lobby to secure the building. Malcolm handed the lead agent the encrypted drive containing the real ledgers and quietly informed him that Brielle was in the basement and had just provided a recorded confession regarding her knowledge of the fraud. We walked out into the bright morning sunlight. The air smelled fresh and clean. My parents were losing their home. My brother-in-law was facing decades in federal prison, and my sister had just handed the prosecutors the very evidence they needed to indict her as an accomplice. I slid into the passenger seat of our car and looked at the man who had stood by my side through years of my family's abuse. We had not just survived their cruelty, we had dismantled their entire fake empire without breaking a single law. The drive away from Spencer's office was the quietest we had ever been, but it was a comfortable silence. Malcolm kept his hand resting on my knee as we navigated through the morning traffic. My phone was vibrating endlessly in the cup holder. Roland was calling. Vivian was calling. The news of Spencer's arrest and Brielle's immediate detainment must have reached them. I did not answer. I wanted them to sit in their panic and realize that their invisible shield of wealth had completely evaporated. We did not go back to our apartment. Malcolm turned the car toward the affluent suburbs where my parents' estate sat behind its wrought iron gates. The estate that I now legally owned. When we pulled into the long circular driveway, the front door was already standing wide open. We walked inside the grand foyer. The house was in a state of absolute chaos. Expensive vases were knocked over, and half-filled suitcases were scattered across the marble floor. My parents were frantically trying to gather whatever liquid assets and jewelry they could find before the federal agents arrived with asset-freezing warrants. Roland was standing in the center of the sunken living room, barking orders at Vivian, who was weeping uncontrollably as she stuffed diamond necklaces into a leather tote bag. When Roland saw us standing in the doorway, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He dropped the stack of documents he was holding and marched toward me. "You little traitor!" He spat, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You destroyed this family. Spencer is in federal custody and they just dragged your sister out of her house in handcuffs. What did you do to the audit, Aaliyah? What did you give them?" I stood perfectly still, letting his anger wash over me without feeling a single ounce of fear. "I gave them the truth, Roland," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I gave them the real ledgers. The ones that showed exactly where the church foundation money went." Roland stopped pacing and glared at me. His chest was heaving and his eyes were wild. "You stupid, naive girl," he yelled. "You have no idea how the real world works. You think you are so righteous standing there acting like some kind of moral savior, but you just burned down everything I built. You ruined the family name for what? For some missing donations." "Missing donations," I repeated, stepping closer to him. "He stole $6 million from working-class families. He stole from the church parishioners who trusted you to manage their community funds. He bought yachts and sports cars with money meant for community outreach and scholarships. And you knew about it." I wanted to hear him say it. I needed to hear him say it. Malcolm stood slightly behind me, his hands resting casually in his pockets. "Of course I knew!" Roland screamed, throwing his hands up in the air. "I am the one who introduced him to the board. I am the one who vouched for his financial firm. When I found out he was running a Ponzi scheme with the church capital, it was too late to fix the deficit. If I had exposed him, the scandal would have destroyed me. It would have destroyed Vivian. It would have completely ruined our standing at the country club and erased every ounce of credibility we had in this city." Vivian stopped packing and looked up, her tear-streaked face pale with terror as her husband continued to dig his own grave. "Roland, pay attention to what you are saying," she whimpered, but Roland was too far gone in his own arrogant rage to listen. We had an image to maintain. "Aaliyah," he continued, pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. "We are the pinnacle of Black excellence in this community. Do you know how hard I worked to get us into these rooms? Do you know what it takes to sit at tables with the wealthiest people in this state and command their respect? We had to look flawless. We had to project absolute power and unshakable wealth. If the parishioners found out their money was gone, the community would have lost their ultimate role models. They need us to look successful, so they have something to aspire to." I stared at him, feeling a sickening realization settle in my stomach. "You let Spencer steal their life savings just so you could keep playing pretend," I said. "You used the very people you claim to uplift as stepping stones to maintain a fake empire. You covered up a massive federal crime to protect your country club membership." "It was a necessary sacrifice," Roland snapped, stepping right up to my face, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "The community funds were a small price to pay to keep our legacy intact. I helped Spencer shuffle the accounts. I authorized the fake grants to cover his tracks because that is what family does. We protect our own. We protect the empire. And you just handed our entire legacy to the federal government because you were always too weak to carry the weight of real power." The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. The only sound in the room was Vivian's quiet sobbing and the heavy breathing of a man who believed his own twisted lies. I looked at him and smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had just delivered the final fatal blow. You are right, Roland, I said softly. I am not cut out for your kind of power, but I am very good at dismantling it. Malcolm calmly pulled his hand out of his jacket pocket. He stepped forward and placed a small black device on the glass coffee table, right in front of where Roland was standing. A tiny red light blinked rhythmically on the top of the device. Roland stared down at it, his brow furrowed in confusion before the devastating reality began to register. He looked from the device to Malcolm, and then to me. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking old and hollow. As a federal contractor assisting in an active criminal investigation, Malcolm stated, his voice carrying the same clinical authority he had used with Brielle. I am authorized to record any interactions with persons of interest. This device has been transmitting a live audio feed directly to the Department of Justice servers for the last 15 minutes. Roland's knees seemed to give out. He collapsed onto the edge of the sofa, staring blankly at the flashing red light. Vivian let out a piercing wail and dropped the bag of jewelry, scattering diamonds across the marble floor. You just gave a full recorded confession to aiding and abetting a federal Ponzi scheme. Malcolm continued. You admitted to wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. You admitted that you intentionally hid the theft of $6 million to protect your social standing. Roland could not speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life controlling everyone around him was finally entirely powerless. He was just a broken man sitting in a house he no longer owned, waiting for the inevitable. I walked over to the coffee table and looked down at my father. You always said I was a disappointment because I did not understand black excellence. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. But there is nothing excellent about stealing from your own people to buy a seat at a table where you never truly belonged. Your legacy is not power, Roland. Your legacy is a prison sentence. I turned my back on them and walked toward the front door with Malcolm right beside me. As we stepped out onto the front porch, the wail of sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder as multiple federal vehicles turned onto the private drive. I did not look back as they swarmed the house. I just kept walking down the driveway toward our car, breathing in the crisp air of a life that finally belonged only to me. The swiftness of the federal justice system is usually a myth, but when the evidence is handed to them on a silver platter, they move with terrifying speed. Both Spencer and my father were indicted within 48 hours. However, white-collar criminals always have a backup plan. Spencer had managed to secure bail using a shadow account that even Malcolm had not initially detected. My father was also out on bail, but his assets were entirely frozen, and my parents were currently living in a cheap motel while they awaited trial. The country club had officially expelled them, and the church foundation had released a public statement condemning their actions. Their pristine image of black excellence was nothing more than a cautionary tale on the evening news. But Spencer was not planning to stick around for the trial. He was a coward who had always relied on other people to clean up his messes, and now that my father could no longer protect him, he was preparing to cut his losses. Malcolm had kept a digital tripwire on the dark web accounts tied to Spencer's original shell companies. Late on a Tuesday night, Malcolm's laptop chimed with a high-priority alert. Spencer was moving. He was attempting to liquidate the very last of his hidden crypto assets and routing them to a bank in Zurich. Malcolm tracked the IP address and discovered that Spencer was not just moving money, he was moving himself. He had purchased a one-way, first-class ticket to Switzerland under a secondary passport he had acquired years ago from a small Caribbean nation. The flight was scheduled to leave from an international terminal in Seattle the following evening. Spencer was going to run. Malcolm intercepted an encrypted audio message Spencer had sent to his offshore fixer. We sat in our living room and listened to the voice of the man my sister had worshipped. Spencer sounded frantic but incredibly callous. He told his fixer to finalize the transfer immediately. The fixer asked what would happen to Brielle and Roland. Spencer actually laughed, a cold, breathless sound. He said, "Let Roland and Brielle rot in prison. They are the ones who demanded the luxury lifestyle and they can take the fall for it." He explicitly stated that he was leaving them behind to face the federal prosecutors alone so he could start over in Europe with a clean slate. He did not care about his wife. He did not care about the family that had shielded him. He only cared about his own survival. I felt a brief flash of something that almost felt like pity for my sister. She had thrown me away to secure her place beside a man who was now abandoning her to face a decade behind bars. But the pity evaporated as quickly as it came. Brielle had made her bed and now she was going to face the nightmare she had helped create. Malcolm immediately contacted his liaison at the Department of Justice. He forwarded the audio file of Spencer's confession and the details of his flight itinerary. The federal agents were more than happy to arrange a farewell committee for my brother-in-law. They asked Malcolm and me to be there to positively identify him, since he had altered his appearance to match the secondary passport. The next afternoon, Malcolm and I drove to the airport. We stood on the overlooking balcony of the international terminal flanked by two plainclothes federal marshals. The terminal was bustling with travelers heading to exotic destinations. I scanned the crowd until I spotted him. Spencer was wearing a baseball cap and a dark overcoat trying to blend in. He looked nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder as he approached the first-class check-in desk. He had a single leather duffel bag. He was leaving his entire life behind without a second thought. I watched him hand his dark blue secondary passport to the ticketing agent. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, drumming his fingers on the counter. He actually thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he was going to board that plane, drink champagne over the Atlantic, and disappear into the Swiss Alps while my family burned in the fire he started. The ticketing agent swiped the passport through the scanner. She looked at her screen and then looked back up at Spencer. Her polite customer service smile vanished. She typed something on her keyboard and swiped the passport a second time. Spencer leaned forward, asking if there was a problem. His voice was tight with rising panic. The agent picked up her desk phone and spoke quietly into the receiver. I do not know exactly what she said, but Spencer knew exactly what it meant. He reached out and tried to snatch the passport back from her hand, but she pulled it away and stepped back from the counter. Spencer looked around wildly like a trapped animal, realizing the cage had just snapped shut. He turned to run toward the exit, but he did not make it more than 5 steps. 4 federal marshals converged on him from the crowd, tackling him directly to the polished floor of the terminal. His hat flew off, and his duffel bag hit the ground, spilling a stack of banded $100 bills across the walkway. Travelers gasped and stepped back as the agents pinned his arms behind his back and locked heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Malcolm and I walked down the stairs and approached the scene. The marshals hauled Spencer to his feet. His face was pressed against the cold tile just moments before, and he had a red mark across his cheek. When he looked up and saw me standing there, the sheer terror in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. "You are not going to Switzerland, Spencer," I said, my voice perfectly calm over the murmur of the watching crowd. "Your secondary passport was flagged and revoked 3 hours ago. You are going to federal prison, and you are going to take the exact same deal you were trying to force onto my parents." He tried to struggle against the marshals shouting that he had money and could pay us off. He was completely unhinged, begging and pleading, making a total spectacle of himself in the middle of the airport. It was a pathetic display from a man who used to pride himself on his flawless composure. Malcolm leaned in close to Spencer. "We heard the audio file," Spencer Malcolm whispered. "We heard you say you were leaving Brielle to take the fall. I already forwarded that recording to your wife's attorney. She knows you tried to abandon her. You have absolutely no one left." The marshals began to drag him away toward the security exit. He was crying now, actual tears of defeat streaming down his face as he realized his grand escape had just become the final nail in his coffin. I watched them shove him into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. He was trapped. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but there was still one last confrontation waiting for me. My mother had been calling me relentlessly from her cheap motel room, and it was finally time to answer. I stared at my phone for a long moment, watching my mother's name flash across the screen. She had been calling me relentlessly from the cheap roadside motel, where she and Roland were hiding out after the banks foreclosed on their estate. I finally pressed the button to accept the call. Vivian's voice came through the speaker, frantic and breathless. She told me that the news of Spencer's arrest was playing on every local station and that the federal agents had just frozen their very last checking account. She demanded that I wire her $50,000 immediately so they could hire a proper crisis management firm. She had the absolute nerve to say that I owed them this money because they had clothed and fed me for 18 years. She said family was supposed to stick together during hard times. I listened to her pathetic attempts at manipulation and felt a deep, hollow calm. I told her that she lost the right to call me family a long time ago, and that the only thing she could expect from me was the final eviction notice on her property. I hung up the phone and blocked her number forever. Malcolm and I left the airport and drove back toward the city center. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for my entire life was completely gone. The air felt lighter. We decided to stop for a late lunch at an upscale bistro located in the heart of the luxury shopping district. We sat at a small corner table by the window, watching the busy street outside. Malcolm opened his government-issued laptop to check in with his agency liaisons. He read through his secure messages and calmly informed me that the Department of Justice had just executed the final sweep of asset freezes. Every single credit card trust fund and offshore account tied to Brielle and Spencer was now officially locked and under federal control. I was just taking a sip of my sparkling water when I saw her. "Speak of the devil," I murmured. Brielle was walking down the opposite side of the street, flanked by two of her wealthiest and most superficial friends from the country club. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a limited edition handbag that cost more than most people's annual salary. She was laughing far too loudly, tossing her hair and acting as if her husband had not just been tackled to the ground by federal marshals. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, desperately trying to convince her social circle that the rumors of their financial ruin were just a ridiculous misunderstanding. I watched through the large glass window of the bistro as Brielle led her friends into the most exclusive boutique on the block. The front of the store was entirely glass, giving Malcolm and me a perfect view of the impending disaster. The sales associates immediately rushed over to offer the women complimentary glasses of champagne. Brielle was pointing at silk dresses, cashmere coats, and expensive shoes, acting like she owned the entire building. She was frantically trying to buy her way out of her own reality. She needed her friends to see her spending money so they would not believe the news reports circling the internet. After about 30 minutes of parading around the store, Brielle confidently walked up to the register. The sales associate neatly folded a massive pile of designer clothes into several large branded shopping bags. The total must have been astronomical. I watched Brielle pull a sleek platinum credit card from her designer wallet and hand it to the cashier with a practiced, arrogant flick of her wrist. She took a sip of her champagne and smiled at her friends who were watching her with thinly veiled jealousy. The cashier ran the card through the terminal. Even from across the street, I could tell the exact moment the machine declined the transaction. The cashier's polite customer service smile faltered. She tapped the screen, frowned, and tried running the card a second time. She shook her head and quietly said something to Brielle. My sister's smug smile instantly vanished. She looked intensely annoyed and dug into her wallet to pull out a different gold card. She slapped it onto the glass counter. The cashier ran the second card. The machine beeped a flat denial. It declined again. Brielle's two friends exchanged a very long and very meaningful look. They took a small collective step away from her. The whispering started. Brielle's face turned a dark mottled shade of red. She began waving her arms and yelling at the cashier, pointing at the machine. She was clearly demanding that they run the cards again, claiming there must be a technical error with the store's system. The boutique manager walked over and gently slid the cards back across the counter, shaking his head firmly. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. Brielle snatched her useless plastic cards off the counter and stormed out of the boutique, leaving her friends standing there in stunned silence. She burst out onto the sidewalk, pacing furiously like a caged animal. A second later, my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed my sister's name. I answered the call and kept my eyes fixed on her through the window. She was screaming so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. She told me I was a vindictive, jealous monster. She accused me of hacking into her bank accounts and telling Malcolm to illegally freeze her personal shopping funds. She yelled that I was just a bitter failure who could never afford to shop at places like that, and that I was trying to drag her down to my pathetic level. She said she was going to have me arrested for financial sabotage. I let her scream until she ran completely out of breath. Then I told her to turn around and look across the street. I watched her stop pacing. She slowly turned her head and saw me sitting in the bistro window holding my phone to my ear. The look of pure venom on her face was priceless. I stood up, told Malcolm I would be right back, and walked out the door of the restaurant to meet her on the sidewalk. Brielle marched toward me, closing the distance between us with heavy, angry steps. Her friends had stepped out of the boutique holding their own shopping bags, eager to watch the spectacle unfold. Brielle pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me I had ruined her life. She said I set Spencer up because I was obsessed with destroying her perfect marriage. She said I was nothing but a jealous loser who could not stand to see her happy. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or back away. I looked at my sister with nothing but cold, clinical pity. I told her that I did not freeze her credit cards. I told her the federal government froze them because every single dollar in those accounts was stolen from a charity foundation. I made sure my voice was loud and clear enough for her friends to hear every single word. I told her that her entire life was funded by a Ponzi scheme and that her perfect husband had just tried to flee the country to Switzerland, leaving her behind to take the fall for his crimes. Her friends gasped audibly. One of them actually covered her mouth in shock before pulling out her phone to undoubtedly text the rest of their country club circle. The illusion was completely shattered. Brielle's arms fell limply to her sides. The reality of her situation finally broke through her massive wall of denial. She was not a wealthy socialite anymore. She was the penniless wife of a federal criminal, and everyone in her circle now knew the truth. I turned my back on her and walked back into the restaurant, leaving her standing on the sidewalk with absolutely nothing left to hide behind. Malcolm and I returned to our car, leaving Brielle to face the reality of her shattered life on the pavement. The city felt different now. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for my entire life was completely gone. The air felt lighter. We drove back to our apartment to finally get some rest. But my mother Vivian was never one to surrender quietly. Even living in a cheap motel with her assets frozen, she still believed she could manipulate the narrative and control everyone around her. 2 days later, I received a formal email from Pastor Thomas, the head of the church foundation board. He requested my immediate presence at the community center for a prayer circle and family intervention. My mother had apparently reached out to the church elders claiming I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She told them I was working with malicious federal agents to frame Spencer and ruin my parents out of deep-seated jealousy. She wanted the church leaders to pray for my soul and convince me to drop the false accusations. Malcolm read the email over my shoulder and shook his head. She really thinks she can charm her way out of a federal indictment, he said. I did not feel angry. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion at her endless capacity for deception. I printed out a thick stack of documents from Malcolm's secure drive. I told Malcolm we were going to church. When we arrived at the community center, the parking lot was quiet. We walked into the main conference room. My mother was sitting at the center of a large oak table, looking like a tragic martyr. She wore a modest dark dress and held a crumpled tissue in her hands. Roland sat beside her, looking defeated, but maintaining his usual stern posture. 6 of the highest-ranking church elders were seated around them. They looked at me with expressions of deep pity and sorrow as I walked into the room. Pastor Thomas stood up and gestured to an empty chair opposite my mother. Aaliyah, we are so glad you came, Pastor, Thomas said, his voice dripping with pastoral concern. Your mother came to us in tears. She explained how much you are hurting and how this vindictive delusion has torn your family apart. We want to pray with you. We want to help you see the light before you cause any more irreversible damage to Spencer's reputation and your parents' legacy. I looked at my mother. She dabbed her dry eyes with the tissue. Aaliyah, please, she whispered, playing her part perfectly. I know you have always felt overshadowed by Brielle, but destroying her husband and putting your father through this nightmare is not the answer. We forgive you. We just want our daughter back. Drop these ridiculous claims and let us heal as a family. The elders nodded in agreement, murmuring their support for my mother's incredible grace and forgiveness. They had no idea that their own retirement funds and community outreach grants had paid for Brielle's designer handbags and Spencer's attempted escape to Switzerland. They still believed my parents were the generous pillars of Black excellence who had built their church. They thought I was just a bitter, jealous daughter trying to ruin a perfect family. I did not sit down. I stood at the end of the table and opened my leather briefcase. I pulled out the thick stack of papers I had printed earlier. I walked around the room, placing a stapled packet in front of each church elder. I did not give one to my mother or father. I am not here for an intervention, I said, my voice echoing calmly in the quiet room. And I am certainly not here to apologize to the people who stole your money. My mother tried to gasp in horror, but I did not let her interrupt. I pointed to the packets in front of the elders. Pastor Thomas, I said, please open to the first page. That is a certified copy of Spencer's federal bankruptcy filing and the Department of Justice asset freeze order. The second page is a direct transcript of Spencer's recorded confession, where he admits to running a Ponzi scheme using the church foundation capital and plans to flee the country. The third page is the real unedited ledger. It highlights the exact routing numbers where your community outreach funds were funneled into my parents' personal offshore accounts. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the rustling of paper as 6 church elders frantically flipped through the documents. Pastor Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the highlighted federal seals and the undeniable lists of missing funds. The look of pastoral concern on his face slowly melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He read the transcript of Spencer laughing about leaving the church bankrupt. He looked at the bank routing numbers that matched the exact accounts my father had set up. My mother panicked. She stood up and reached across the table, trying to grab the papers away from an elder sitting near her. "Those are fake," she yelled, her carefully crafted martyr persona shattering instantly. "She is lying. Aaliyah is sick. She fabricated these documents to destroy us. You cannot believe a word she says." Pastor Thomas pulled the packet out of her reach. He looked at the routing numbers again, and then looked up at my father. "Roland," Pastor Thomas said, his voice shaking with a terrifying quiet rage. "This account number right here. This is the exact account you told us was a high-yield community bond. You told us this money was securing the new youth center." My father stared at the table, unable to meet the pastor's eyes. His silence was the loudest confession he could have ever made. He looked like a deflated balloon, completely stripped of his arrogance. The other elders began to speak over each other, their voices rising in panic and fury, as they read through the exact amounts that had been stolen from their parishioners. They realized that the thousands of dollars they had personally donated, the money collected from working-class families week after week, had been used to fund my parents' lavish lifestyle. "Vivian, please," my father whispered, trying to grab her arm, but she yanked it away. She was backed into a corner, looking wildly at the men who had just been praying for her. She tried to speak, to spin another lie, but the evidence was right in front of them in black and white. The federal seals on the documents were impossible to deny. "You invited these men here to humiliate me, Mom," I said, looking at her terrified face. "You thought you could use their faith and their trust to bully me into dropping a federal case. But you forgot one thing. You cannot gaslight the federal government, and you cannot manipulate the truth once it is printed on paper." Pastor Thomas stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He looked at my parents with absolute disgust. "Roland," he said, his voice booming with righteous anger, "you and your wife are a disgrace. You preyed on our faith. You stole from the very people who looked up to you. We will be contacting our own legal counsel immediately and providing these documents to every member of the congregation." The intervention was over. But it was not me who needed saving. My mother collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands, as the church elders turned their backs on her and began making frantic phone calls to the rest of the board. Their voices were loud and frantic, echoing through the community center that my parents had used as a personal bank. I closed my briefcase, snapped the latches shut, and walked toward the door. Malcolm opened it for me, his hand resting securely on the small of my back. I did not say goodbye to my parents. They were no longer my family. They were just two criminals sitting in a room full of their victims, waiting for the consequences of a lifetime of greed to finally catch up to them. We walked out of the community center into the cool evening air, leaving the chaos of my mother's ruined reputation behind us. The parking lot was mostly empty now, except for a few cars sitting under the flickering streetlights. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of closure. The truth was finally out in the open, and the people who had abused me for years were facing the reality they had tried so hard to avoid. Malcolm had his arm wrapped protectively around my shoulders, guiding me toward our vehicle. We were just steps away from the car when a dark figure stepped out from behind a large delivery van, completely blocking our path. It was Spencer. My heart did a hard, painful thump against my ribs. He looked absolutely unhinged. The polished, arrogant man who used to sneer at me across the dinner table was completely gone. His designer clothes were wrinkled and stained. He smelled strongly of stale alcohol, and his eyes were wild and manic. He was out on bail waiting for his federal trial, but it was clear that desperation had driven him to the very edge of his sanity. He had nothing left. His assets were frozen, his passport was revoked, and his wife was practically penniless. "Well, well, well, look who it is!" Spencer sneered, his voice slurring slightly as he took a step toward us. "The little family traitor. You think you are so smart, Aaliyah. You think you won because you handed a few documents to the feds. Spencer, you need to step away from us right now," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible, even though my pulse was racing. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the empty parking lot. "I am not going anywhere until I get what is mine," he spat, stepping closer. "You ruined my life. You froze my accounts. But I know you have money, Aaliyah. I know you own the estate now, and you have access to clean funds. You are going to wire $2 million to a secure offshore account by midnight tonight." I stared at him in disbelief. "You are out of your mind, Spencer. You are facing decades in federal prison, and you are standing in a parking lot trying to extort me. I am not giving you a single cent." Spencer's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He reached into the pocket of his heavy overcoat and pulled out a thick steel wrench. The metal glinted menacingly under the streetlight. He slapped the wrench against his open palm, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "You do not understand how this works, Aaliyah," he growled, closing the distance between us until he was only a few feet away. "I have absolutely nothing left to lose. My life is over because of you. If you do not give me that money so I can pay a fixer to get me out of this country, I will beat you until you cannot walk. I will smash your skull in right here on the concrete, and I will not lose a single second of sleep over it. Do not test me. I will make you pay for what you did to me." He raised the wrench, gripping it tightly with both hands, ready to swing. I braced myself, my breath catching in my throat. But before Spencer could even move his arm, Malcolm stepped smoothly in front of me. He placed his body entirely between me and my deranged brother-in-law, shielding me completely. Malcolm did not look scared. He did not even look surprised. He looked at Spencer with the same cold, clinical annoyance one might reserve for a pest. "Get out of my way, you weak little desk clerk!" Spencer yelled, pointing the wrench at Malcolm's chest. "This has nothing to do with you. Step aside, or I will lay you out right next to your wife." Malcolm did not move. Instead, he calmly reached inside his tailored suit jacket. Spencer tensed, thinking Malcolm was reaching for a weapon, but Malcolm simply pulled out a solid black leather wallet. With a quick flick of his wrist, he flipped the wallet open and held it up. Pinned to the leather was a heavy silver badge bearing the official seal of the United States government. Spencer froze. His eyes darted from the badge to Malcolm's face, and the heavy steel wrench in his hand slowly lowered to his side. "I am not a desk clerk," Spencer Malcolm said, his voice ringing with absolute deadly authority. "My name is Special Agent Malcolm Hayes. I am a senior investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. I was assigned to audit your fraudulent foundation months before I even met my wife. And you just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life." All the blood drained from Spencer's face. He stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. The man he had mocked for years, the man he had called a boring nobody, was the very federal agent who had built the criminal case against him. "You just attempted to extort $2 million from a federal witness." Malcolm continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You also just threatened physical violence with a deadly weapon against the wife of a federal agent. That is aggravated assault and extortion. Those charges alone carry a mandatory 20-year sentence on top of the wire fraud and money laundering you are already facing." "No," Spencer whispered, his hands shaking violently as the wrench slipped from his grip and clattered loudly onto the asphalt. "No, this is a trick. You are just an accountant." Malcolm reached to his lapel and pressed a small button hidden beneath the fabric of his jacket. "I am the man who is going to put you in a concrete box for the rest of your natural life," Malcolm said coldly. "Your bail conditions explicitly stated you were not to contact any witnesses involved in the investigation. Your bail is officially revoked." Spencer turned to run, but it was entirely too late. The wail of sirens pierced the quiet evening air. 3 dark, unmarked federal SUVs suddenly swerved into the parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the dark buildings. They surrounded us, cutting off any possible escape route. Heavily armed federal marshals poured out of the vehicles, shouting orders and drawing their weapons. Spencer dropped to his knees before they even reached him. He put his hands behind his head, sobbing uncontrollably as the marshals descended upon him. They forced him face down onto the rough concrete, pulling his arms back and securing them with heavy steel handcuffs. He was crying out for mercy, begging for a deal, sobbing that his life was over. I stood safely behind my husband, watching the pathetic man who had terrorized my family and stolen millions of dollars being hauled to his feet like a common thug. Malcolm turned to me and gently pulled me into his arms, holding me close as we watched them shove Spencer into the back of a federal vehicle. The doors slammed shut, sealing his fate forever. "It is finally over," Malcolm whispered, kissing the top of my head. "He is never going to hurt you or anyone else, ever again." I leaned against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting beat of his heart. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the parking lot, casting long shadows into the night. My parents were ruined. My sister was disgraced, and the man who had orchestrated it all was heading to a federal penitentiary for decades. The fake empire of black excellence had been completely dismantled, and I had my beautiful, brilliant federal agent husband to thank for it. We walked back to our car, leaving the flashing lights behind us, ready to finally start our own life in peace. Spencer was locked away in a federal holding cell, but my parents were far from finished. Despite Pastor Thomas and the local elders discovering the truth about the stolen community funds, Vivian and Roland still had one final desperate card to play. The annual regional megachurch gala was only 2 days away. It was the most prestigious charity event of the year, attended by thousands of wealthy parishioners, local politicians, and influential business owners. My parents had spent the entire year hyping up their grand announcement. They were scheduled to pledge a massive $5 million endowment to build a new regional youth outreach center. Of course, that $5 million did not exist. The money they were planning to publicly donate was supposed to come from the very offshore accounts that Malcolm's federal team had completely frozen. But my parents were trapped in a severe state of narcissistic delusion. They had somehow convinced the regional bishop that Pastor Thomas was simply confused about the local accounting, and they desperately pushed forward with their gala appearance. They believed that if they made the massive announcement publicly and collected the millions of dollars in matching donations from the wealthy gala attendees, they could quickly launder the new money, use it to pay off the local elders, and quietly flee the country before any formal federal indictments dropped. It was a terrifyingly reckless gamble born out of pure arrogance. Malcolm and I spent the morning in the Federal Command Center going over the final blueprints of the gala venue. The event was being held at a massive luxury hotel in the center of the city. Malcolm explained that his financial crimes division had been building this exact sting operation for weeks. My parents thought they were the guests of honor, but they were actually walking blindly into a carefully constructed federal trap. Every single piece of their financial fraud had been documented. This gala was their final act of wire fraud. Soliciting donations based on a fake endowment was a federal crime, and doing it across state lines with regional attendees elevated it to a massive felony. The evening of the gala arrived with a crisp chill in the air. I wore a simple dark gown and slipped through a side service entrance accompanied by two undercover female agents. We positioned ourselves in the shadows at the back of the grand ballroom. The room was spectacularly lavish. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the crowd. Thousands of white roses adorned the tables, and soft classical music drifted through the air as the city's elite mingled and drank expensive champagne. They were all completely unaware that the serving staff pouring their drinks, the valet drivers parking their luxury cars, and the security guards standing at the doors were almost entirely composed of undercover federal agents. I watched from the shadows as my parents made their grand entrance. Vivian was wearing a custom designer gown covered in hand-stitched crystals that cost more than most people's cars. Roland was beside her in a sharp, bespoke tuxedo. They walked down the grand carpeted staircase, waving and smiling flawlessly, masking the sheer panic that must have been eating them alive from the inside. They looked like absolute royalty. Vivian was laughing and kissing cheeks, acting like her oldest daughter had not just exposed them to their local church board, and her son-in-law was not currently sitting in a federal prison cell. She was putting on the performance of a century desperate to secure those matching donations so she could buy her way out of a prison sentence. I stood perfectly still watching them shake hands with regional bishops and wealthy donors. The sheer audacity of their lies was almost hypnotic. They took their seats at the prominent head table right at the very front of the stage. They sipped sparkling water and nodded piously as the evening officially began. Pastor Williams, the head of the regional megachurch, took the stage to welcome the guests. He spoke passionately about the power of giving, the importance of community, and the blessing of charity. He then turned his attention to my parents, praising them as the guiding light of their congregation and the ultimate example of selfless devotion. He called them true servants of the community. Every word he spoke made my stomach turn, but I kept my face completely blank. My mother beamed from her table, holding my father's hand and looking incredibly humble. They were scheduled to speak next. They were going to stand up in front of 2,000 people and announce a $5 million lie to steal matching funds from innocent believers. Malcolm was stationed in the audiovisual control room high above the ballroom floor. He had direct access to the massive projection screens hanging behind the stage. I touched the small, secure earpiece hidden beneath my hair and listened to the steady radio chatter. Malcolm was directing his teams with cold, precise efficiency. His deep voice echoed clearly in my ear. "Team Alpha is in position at the main exits," Malcolm murmured over the secure channel. "Team Bravo, secure the loading docks and service elevators. Do not let anyone leave the building. Team Charlie, move into the crowd and hold your positions near the head table." I watched as several waiters gently set down their silver trays and subtly shifted their weight. The valet team outside locked down the parking garage. The trap was set, and the net was completely drawn tight. There was absolutely no way out for Vivian and Roland. Pastor Williams finished his opening speech and gestured grandly toward my parents' table. It is my profound honor to introduce Roland and Vivian to share their historic announcement. Pastor Williams declared, his voice booming over the speakers as the entire ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. My parents stood up, bathing in the blind adoration of the crowd, and began walking slowly toward the stage to seal their own fate. Roland and Vivian stepped up to the crystal-clear podium. The applause from the 2,000 wealthy attendees was deafening. Roland adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket and leaned into the microphone. His voice was smooth and practiced, echoing through the massive ballroom. He thanked Pastor Williams and began weaving a beautiful, disgusting lie about the importance of community and the future of our youth. Vivian stood beside him, nodding with fake humility. She dabbed at her dry eyes, pretending to be overcome with emotion. I watched them from the shadows at the back of the room, feeling absolutely nothing but cold anticipation. The undercover agents beside me shifted their weight, perfectly synchronized and ready for my command. Roland raised his hands to quiet the massive crowd. He spoke passionately about the struggles of the modern world and how their family felt a divine calling to step up and provide a safe haven for the next generation. He announced that he and Vivian were pledging $5 million to build the new Regional Youth Outreach Center. The crowd gasped and erupted into another massive standing ovation. Wealthy donors at the front tables were already pulling out their checkbooks, ready to match the incredible generosity of my parents. Roland smiled, his greedy eyes scanning the room as he calculated how much money he was about to steal from these innocent people. He told the crowd to direct their attention to the giant projection screens behind the stage to see the architectural renderings of the new building. That was my cue. I pressed my finger against the hidden earpiece beneath my hair. "Now, Malcolm," I whispered into the tiny microphone. Up in the audio-visual control room, Malcolm executed the override. The massive screens behind my parents went completely black for a split second. The crowd quieted down, waiting for the presentation to begin. Then the screens flickered back to life. But there were no architectural renderings. There were no pictures of happy children or state-of-the-art youth centers. Instead, a massive high-resolution federal flowchart illuminated the ballroom. It was a detailed schematic of my parents' Ponzi scheme, complete with Department of Justice watermarks. The schematic showed the exact flow of stolen money. Bold red arrows connected the regional church foundation accounts directly to shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Detailed lists of missing funds flashed across the screen, next to photographs of Vivian's designer handbags, Roland's luxury vehicles, and Spencer's bankrupt businesses. The exact dates and times of the wire transfers were displayed for all 2,000 guests to read. The ballroom went completely dead silent. The collective confusion morphed into a heavy, suffocating tension. People squinted at the screens, trying to process the complex financial web that clearly spelled out massive federal fraud. Roland and Vivian were still facing the crowd, smiling blankly, wondering why no one was clapping. Roland chuckled nervously into the microphone. "It seems we have a small technical difficulty," he said, trying to play it off. He turned around to look at the massive screens. I watched the exact moment his soul left his body. His fake smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His jaw dropped open. Vivian turned around a second later. She let out a sharp, audible gasp that was picked up by the microphone and broadcasted throughout the entire ballroom. She grabbed Roland's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into his tuxedo jacket. The crowd was no longer silent. Whispers erupted into angry shouts. Wealthy investors and regional church leaders stood up from their tables, pointing at the screens. They recognized the names of the shell companies. They recognized the routing numbers of the accounts they had wired their own charitable donations into. Roland began tapping the microphone frantically. "Turn it off," he yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Turn the screens off right now." He looked up toward the audio-visual booth, waving his arms like a madman. "There has been a mistake," he shouted to the angry crowd. "Our system has been hacked by malicious individuals. Malcolm was not finished. The screen transitioned from the flowchart to a scanned copy of a highly classified federal document. It was the official asset freeze order signed by a federal judge listing Roland and Vivian as the primary targets of a criminal grand jury investigation. Right below the freeze order, Malcolm projected the current balances of my parents' domestic and offshore bank accounts. Every single balance read exactly zero. They were completely broke, and everyone in the room now knew that the $5 million pledge was nothing but a desperate criminal scam to solicit more funds. The illusion of their massive wealth was shattered into a million pieces on a 50-foot screen. My mother completely lost her mind. The poised, elegant socialite vanished. She started screaming at the crowd, telling them it was a setup, telling them that they were rich and that the federal government was lying. She looked completely unhinged, grabbing the podium and demanding that people write their matching donation checks anyway. She yelled that they were pillars of the community and that they deserved respect. The regional bishop who had been sitting at the head table stood up and walked away from them in utter disgust. The other church officials followed suit, refusing to even look at my parents. Roland grabbed Vivian's arm, trying to pull her away from the podium. He finally realized what was happening. He looked at the doors and saw the men in dark suits blocking the exits. He realized the doors were locked and the net had closed. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me, their angry voices fading into a shocked murmur as they watched me approach the stage. The two undercover female agents walked closely behind me, their hands resting subtly on their holstered weapons. Roland and Vivian stopped struggling with each other when they saw me walking toward them. They looked down at me from the stage, their eyes wide with absolute horror as the realization finally crashed down on them. They were completely trapped with nowhere left to run. I stopped at the base of the stage, looking up at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel invisible. The two female agents flanked me perfectly still, their presence radiating a quiet, absolute authority. Roland was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom tuxedo. Vivian's face was streaked with dark tears, her hands shaking violently as she gripped the edge of the podium. Aaliyah Roland choked out his voice, barely carrying over the angry murmur of the crowd. "What are you doing? You are destroying your own family. Turn those screens off right now." I looked at him with a deep, hollow calm. I told him I did not turn the screens on, and I certainly could not turn them off because the federal government was running the presentation now. I told him he destroyed his own family the moment he decided to steal from innocent people to fund his endless greed. But Malcolm was not finished. Up in the secure audiovisual control room, he had one final piece of evidence to present to the regional bishop and the elite congregation. The massive projection screens shifted from the bank statements to a pulsing digital audio wave. The speakers in the massive ballroom crackled to life. It was a recorded phone call intercepted by federal wiretaps weeks ago. Brielle's shrill, whining voice echoed through the massive sanctuary, hitting every corner of the room with crystal clarity. She was crying to our father. "Daddy, you have to fix this." Her recorded voice echoed loudly for all to hear. "If Spencer finds out about the affair, he will divorce me and I will lose everything. You have to pay him off." Roland's deep voice responded on the recording, dripping with arrogant annoyance. "I already took care of it, Brielle." His recorded voice boomed across the silent crowd. "I wired the hush money to your little personal trainer yesterday. I pulled $50,000 straight from the Youth Center Outreach Fund, so it will not leave a paper trail tied to you. Just keep your mouth shut and smile for the cameras. You know how much our image matters to the church board." The audio cut off abruptly, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the massive room. The digital wave vanished from the screen, leaving only the Federal Bureau of Investigation's seal glowing brightly in the dark. The elite community of regional bishops, wealthy donors, and highly conservative parishioners stood in absolute stunned horror. The moral foundation my parents had built their entire empire upon was completely annihilated in less than 60 seconds. They were not just thieves running a Ponzi scheme. They were hypocrites who used sacred charity money meant for children to cover up Brielle's dirty secrets and protect their fragile social status. The regional bishop, the man who had just introduced them as true servants of the community, stood up slowly from his chair at the front table. He did not say a single word. He simply turned his back to the stage. It was a quiet, deliberate movement. One by one, the other church elders followed his lead. The wealthy investors, the local politicians, the country club socialites, they all stood up in unison and physically turned their backs on my parents. It was a silent, devastating execution of their social standing. 2,000 people refusing to even look at them, creating a sea of turned backs that spoke louder than any shouting ever could. Vivian let out a strangled wail. She reached out toward the crowd, begging them to look at her, begging them to listen to her desperate explanations. She cried out that the recording was manipulated, that it was fake audio created by her jealous daughter to ruin her perfect life. She sobbed that she was a woman of faith and that they were being framed by malicious federal agents. But nobody turned around. The silence of the crowd was absolute and terrifying. My parents were completely dead to the elite circle they had worshipped and sacrificed everything for their entire lives. All their expensive clothes, their luxury cars, and their country club memberships meant absolutely nothing now. Roland slumped against the podium, his legs finally giving out. He looked like a hollow shell of the terrifying man who had controlled my life for so long. His face was gray and slack. He looked at the exits and saw the federal agents moving in closer, securing the perimeter. He looked at the screens displaying his empty bank accounts. He looked at the backs of his former friends and followers, and then he looked at me. I walked up the short flight of stairs to the stage. I stood directly in front of my parents. I did not feel any anger anymore. I did not feel sadness or pity. I just felt incredibly free. I looked at Vivian, who had collapsed onto the carpeted stage floor, weeping into her hands, and then at Roland, who could not even meet my eyes. I told them that they had spent my entire life calling me a failure because I chose a quiet, honest life over their loud, flashy lies. I told them that they traded their souls for a lifestyle they could not afford, and now they had to pay the absolute maximum price. The grand double doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly burst open. A team of federal agents in tactical gear marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet in perfect unison. Malcolm walked closely behind them, looking incredibly handsome and terrifyingly official. The crowd parted for them willingly, eager to see the criminals removed from their sacred event. The agents climbed the stage and surrounded my parents in a tight circle. An agent pulled my father's arms behind his back, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists with a sharp click. Another agent pulled Vivian up from the floor, ignoring her frantic screams, and cuffed her as well. The shiny illusion was completely dead, and the harsh reality of federal prison was waiting for them outside the doors. The grand ballroom was instantly transformed into a massive crime scene. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents poured through every single exit, their dark tactical gear a stark contrast to the sparkling crystal chandeliers and $1,000 designer gowns. They moved with terrifying precision, securing the perimeter and ordering the panicked guests to remain in their seats. The elite crowd of wealthy donors, local politicians, and regional church leaders complied instantly. They were too stunned by the undeniable proof of massive financial fraud that was still glowing brightly on the giant projection screens above the stage. The murmurs of shock had turned into a heavy, suffocating silence as the reality of the sting operation set in. Over near the grand buffet table, another scene was unfolding. Spencer had miraculously managed to post a massive bail just hours before the gala began. Vivian had practically bled her last remaining hidden emergency account dry to get him out, desperate to have her golden son-in-law present to maintain their perfect family illusion for the matching donors. He was standing near an ice sculpture wearing a pristine white custom tuxedo and holding a glass of incredibly expensive champagne. When the federal agents breached the main doors, Spencer panicked. He dropped his crystal flute and tried to quietly slip out through the heavy wooden kitchen service doors. But Malcolm had anticipated every single rat trying to flee the sinking ship. Team Bravo was already waiting in the service corridor. I watched from the stage as 3 federal agents intercepted him. Spencer puffed out his chest, trying to use his usual arrogant charm and wealth to talk his way out of the trap. He demanded to call his lawyer and told the agents they had no right to touch him. The agents were completely unfazed. One of them grabbed his shoulder to turn him around, and Spencer made the absolute colossal mistake of trying to shove a federal officer away. In the blink of an eye, the agent swept his legs out from under him. Spencer slammed face first onto the polished marble floor with a heavy thud. His pristine white tuxedo was instantly ruined, smeared with spilled champagne, crushed appetizers, and dirt as the agents pinned him down. They ripped his arms behind his back and slapped the heavy steel cuffs on his wrists with a loud, sharp click. Spencer completely lost his arrogant facade. He began to whimper and plead like a terrified child as they hauled him up to his feet. They dragged him through the center of the ballroom, right in front of the disgusted elite crowd. The wealthy women who had once praised his business acumen now turned their faces away in absolute revulsion. Back on the stage, Roland was completely falling apart. 2 imposing federal agents held him firmly by the arms, reading him his Miranda rights in a cold, steady monotone. Roland was shaking his head frantically, sweat pouring down his face and completely ruining his expensive grooming. He kept repeating that there was a massive misunderstanding, that he was a man of God and a trusted pillar of the community. He tried to appeal to the regional bishop, who was standing just a few feet away, near the front row of tables. Roland begged the bishop to vouch for him, to tell the agents about all the good charitable work they had done. But the bishop simply turned his head, refusing to even make eye contact with the man who had just tried to steal millions from their congregation. Roland then turned his desperate pleading to the lead agent. He offered to make a deal, offering to turn over hidden offshore assets that he claimed he was forced to hide by his business partners. He was willing to throw everyone under the bus to save his own skin. The lead agent simply tightened his iron grip on Roland's arm and told him to save his breath for the federal judge. The sheer terror in Roland's eyes was deeply intoxicating to watch. The man who had ruled his local church board and his family with an iron fist of narcissistic authority was now nothing but a trembling coward facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Vivian was standing a few feet away, watching her entire universe collapse in real time. She was hyperventilating, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps that echoed loudly over the stage microphones. She looked up at the massive screens displaying her empty bank accounts and the undeniable proof of her daughter's hush money scandal. She looked at her husband being read his rights and thoroughly humiliated. She looked out into the crowd and saw her golden son-in-law being dragged out in a ruined white tuxedo, crying like a baby. And then Vivian looked out at the massive ballroom of elite socialites. These were the very people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. They were the country club members, the political donors, the regional church royalty, and they were all glaring at her with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Local politicians were furiously texting their public relations teams to distance themselves from her toxic brand. Wealthy women she had played tennis with were whispering in horror, pointing directly at her handcuffed wrists. The complete and total loss of her social status was infinitely more painful to Vivian than the prospect of prison. Her fragile, narcissistic mind simply could not process the absolute destruction of her public image. Vivian let out a piercing, dramatic shriek that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed backward onto the stage floor in a dramatic dead faint, her heavy crystal-covered designer gown pooling awkwardly around her limp body. The federal agents did not even blink. They had seen every manipulation tactic and theatrical performance in the book. One of the agents calmly knelt down, checked her pulse, confirmed she was breathing perfectly fine, and called for the standby medical team over his radio. But they absolutely did not remove the steel handcuffs from her wrists. Vivian lay there on the cold stage floor, a fallen queen completely stripped of her fake kingdom and her stolen dignity. The paramedics arrived a minute later, waving smelling salts under her nose. When Vivian's eyes fluttered open and she realized she was still securely handcuffed on the floor in front of 2,000 judging eyes, she began to weep uncontrollably. There was no elegant escape and no matching donations to save them. Malcolm walked down from the control booth, his face a mask of cold professional satisfaction as he watched his federal team perfectly execute the final takedown of the most arrogant criminals we had ever known. I watched as the federal agents escorted Roland and Vivian out through the heavy service doors. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the loading dock, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick walls. Local news helicopters were already hovering above the hotel, casting bright white spotlights down onto the concrete. Reporters shouted questions over the barricades, asking my parents if they had anything to say to the thousands of church members they had defrauded. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her head hanging low so the cameras could not get a clear shot of her tear-streaked face. My father walked with a stiff, rigid gait, his eyes staring blankly straight ahead. He looked like a broken man, completely stripped of the arrogant power he had wielded over our family for decades. I stood on the loading dock with Malcolm, his warm hand resting steadily on the small of my back, as the caravan of dark SUVs sped away into the crisp night air. It was finally over. The following months moved with a swift, brutal efficiency. The scandal rocked the entire region, and every day there was a new headline exposing another layer of their massive deception. The regional church board was forced to completely restructure, and they publicly apologized for allowing such blatant corruption to flourish right under their noses. The federal prosecutors had built a case so incredibly watertight that Roland and Vivian did not even have the option to fight it in court. Faced with mountains of undeniable evidence, offshore bank records, and the recorded phone call proving wire fraud and embezzlement, they were forced to take a plea deal. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. He sentenced both of my parents to 15 years in federal prison, citing their egregious abuse of trust and their exploitation of a charitable religious community. Spencer, trying desperately to save himself, immediately filed for divorce from Brielle and attempted to turn state's evidence, but his own financial crimes caught up with him, resulting in a 5-year sentence of his own. The empire they had built on lies and stolen money completely collapsed. The federal government seized every single asset they owned. Their offshore accounts were drained to pay back the victims of the youth center scam, and their luxury vehicles were auctioned off to the highest bidder. But the most satisfying moment of justice came exactly 8 months after the gala. The massive suburban mansion my parents had lived in, the house where I had spent my entire childhood, feeling like an unwanted ghost, was officially foreclosed by the bank. Through my own successful real estate development company, I had recently secured a federal contract to manage and liquidate seized properties in the region. It was an incredible stroke of poetic justice. I stood in the massive marble foyer of the mansion holding a clipboard as a team of professional movers carried out the last remaining pieces of my parents' lavish life. Walking through the empty hallways, I remembered all the holidays where I was treated like a servant, while Brielle was showered with expensive gifts. I walked up the sweeping grand staircase and stepped into what used to be the master suite. The massive walk-in closets that once held Vivian's hundreds of designer dresses and shoes were completely bare. The house felt entirely different now. It was empty, echoing, and stripped of the toxic energy that had suffocated me for years. I watched as a crew member took down a massive family portrait from the wall, leaving nothing but a blank space behind. There was no sadness in my heart as I signed the final foreclosure paperwork, handing the keys over to the bank representative. The mansion was just an empty shell, now ready to be sold to a family who might actually know how to love each other. Brielle's downfall was equally poetic. With Spencer in prison and their assets completely frozen, she was left with absolutely nothing. The golden child who had never worked a day in her life was suddenly forced to face the harsh reality of the real world. The trust fund she had bragged about was gone, and her luxury apartment was repossessed. I found her a few weeks later while I was walking through a high-end outdoor shopping plaza downtown. I glanced through the large glass window of a designer clothing boutique and stopped dead in my tracks. I watched a wealthy customer berate Brielle over a missing dress size. The woman spoke to my sister the exact same way my mother used to speak to waiters and retail workers. There was Brielle wearing a plain black retail uniform, her perfectly styled hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She just stood there taking the verbal abuse, her head bowed in submission because she desperately needed the hourly paycheck. When the angry customer finally stormed out, I walked into the boutique, the bell chiming softly above the door. Brielle turned around, her customer service smile perfectly plastered on her face. "Welcome," she started to say, but the words completely died in her throat when she saw it was me. Her face drained of all color. She looked down at the stack of sweaters in her hands and then back up at me, her eyes filling with a mixture of profound shame and bitter resentment. She looked exhausted. The shiny, arrogant glow she used to carry was completely gone, replaced by the dull, tired reality of a minimum-wage retail job. We stared at each other for a long moment in the quiet store. I did not say a single word to mock her. I did not gloat or remind her of the cruel things she used to say to me when she was living in her luxurious bubble. Her current reality was already a harsher punishment than any words I could ever speak. I just looked at her with a quiet, calm acceptance. I turned around and walked out of the boutique, leaving her standing there to finish her shift. That evening, Malcolm and I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of our new penthouse apartment. The cool night wind brushed past us, carrying the faint sounds of the city below. The city skyline sparkled beneath us, a sea of glittering lights stretching out toward the horizon. The night air was warm and peaceful. Malcolm wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin gently on the top of my head. We had closed on this property just a week ago, a beautiful home purchased with honest money earned through years of hard work and quiet dedication. I leaned back against his chest, listening to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heartbeat. I looked down at the streets where ordinary people were living their lives free from the twisted mind games and financial ruins of a fake religious empire. For the first time in my 32 years of life, I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations. I did not feel the constant anxiety of trying to please people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. The toxic cycle of narcissistic abuse had finally been broken, and the silence they left behind was incredibly beautiful. Malcolm kissed the top of my head and told me how proud he was of my strength. I smiled, leaning into his warmth. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, letting it fill my lungs. The painful chapters of my past, the gaslighting, the emotional neglect, the constant feeling of being the family scapegoat, they were all finally closed. My parents were sitting in federal prison cells, reflecting on a lifetime of greed and deception. My sister was learning the harsh lessons of humility in a retail stockroom. And I was standing on top of the world, completely surrounded by the peace and genuine love I had always deserved. The nightmare was permanently over, and my real life, the one I had fought so desperately to build, was finally ready to begin.